On paper, the Soviet Union produced millions of tons of food each year, enough, according to official statistics, to feed every household. But in many cities, the shelves inside the neighborhood grocery stores stood almost bare. The doors were open, the cashiers were present, yet there was almost nothing to buy. So what did people actually eat when the stores were empty? That question is where this story begins. Not in the grand halls of state planning meetings, but in the quiet spaces of kitchens and stairwell, in long queues that formed before sunrise, and in the ordinary rituals of feeding a family when certainty didn't exist. It's one thing to read about shortages in economic reports. It's another to imagine standing in a store where the glass display cases hold only a few cans, maybe some jars of pickles, or a stack of tin sprats, and that's all. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. The white tiles reflect nothing, and the silence is broken only by people asking the same question in different ways. When will there be delivery? And the answer was rarely clear. People learned over years that availability didn't work the way they were told it should. Posters and slogans promised abundance. Newspapers praised collective harvests, but daily life unfolded according to rumor, chance, and timing. Someone might hear that butter had appeared in one district, or that sugar would arrive tomorrow, a word that could mean an hour, or a week, or never. And so the day began earlier than work, earlier than school, sometimes earlier than dawn. In many places, queues formed long before the goods themselves existed. A line would appear because someone said they heard a truck was coming. People joined because everyone else was joining. A handwritten list might circulate to keep order names, numbers, positions. People guarded their place in the line with the quiet intensity of those who knew that missing a delivery might shape the next month of it. In that environment, the question of what did people eat becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a window into a different logic of daily survival, one where meals were shaped not just by taste, but by availability, by substitution, by patience, and by networks of trust. Before we look inside the kitchen though, it helps to understand the strangeness of the stores themselves. Walk into a typical urban food shop during one of the bad years, and the contrast could feel almost surreal. The structure of the store, the counters, scales, and product categories was still there, like a stage waiting for actors who never arrived. The butcher section might display only bones. The dairy counter might offer bottles of kefir then nothing for weeks. Sometimes there was a single product filling entire shelves. Jars of mustard, crates of mineral water, or kilos of salted fish no one particularly wanted but took anyway. Yet the place wasn't empty of people. Clerks worked. Shoppers browsed out of habit. Everyone scanned the room with the same hope, that something useful might appear. Maybe flour, maybe sausage, maybe anything with calories. And when something did arrive, it rarely lasted. A delivery could vanish within minutes. A queue outside turned into a crowd inside. The decision in that moment was not, do I like this? But can this be turned into a meal? That distinction shaped how people thought about food. Instead of planning from a recipe and buying ingredients, many households reversed the process. They bought whatever appeared, then figured out how to transform it later. Meals were improvised from what existed, not from what was desired. This way of living didn't feel dramatic on a daily basis. It felt routine, normalized, woven into the rhythm of time itself. But it created a quiet tension that ran through everyday moments, especially in the kitchen. Imagine opening a cupboard and seeing jars carefully saved from previous seasons, bags of grain folded at the top to keep insects away, and tins whose labels had faded from being handled too many times. The freezer, if a family had one, might hold pieces of meat obtained months earlier through a connection or a lucky purchase. The refrigerator could contain more glass jars than fresh food leftovers preserved because wasting anything simply wasn't an option. This wasn't about constant hunger in a dramatic sense. Many households did manage to eat, but what they ate and how often depended on strategies built quietly over years. And that brings us to the central puzzle of this story. When the stores so often had nothing, what sustained daily life? Part of the answer lies in the meals themselves. People relied on staples that could stretch across days, porridges from buckwheat or millet, potatoes cooked in endless variations, soups that could be diluted or thickened depending on what else was available, bread that was eaten fresh when possible, but also dried into rusks to make it last. There was creativity in these meals, but not in a romantic or nostalgic sense. It was practical creativity, the kind that emerges when you only have a few ingredients and a responsibility to make them work. Leftover broth might become the base for the next day's soup. A small amount of sausage could be sliced thinly and spread across many plates. Cabbage appeared in everything, boiled, stewed, fermented, or mixed with grains to extend their volume. People learned to substitute not just ingredients, but expectations. And still, each meal raised another question. What about tomorrow? That question wasn't only about food security in the abstract. It was about the emotional reality of planning under uncertainty. Parents thought about how to ensure children had enough. Elderly relatives worried about being a burden. Students and workers carried bags everywhere, just in case they passed a shop with something inside. Life became organized around possibility. A walk across town could turn into an entire day if someone heard there might be butter in a different district. Conversations in stairwells, workplaces, and buses carried fragments of intelligence rumors about deliveries, hints about connections, whispered advice about where to go and when. And those networks mattered as much as the stores themselves. Some goods didn't simply appear on shelves. They circulated through favors, through coworkers, through relatives who worked in warehouses or transport depots. Access wasn't guaranteed, but relationships sometimes opened doors that official availability did not. Which leads to the next layer of this story: the unwritten systems that replaced formal distribution, and the quiet negotiations people made to feed their households. Before we get there, it's worth pausing on something else: the difference between statistics and lived experience. Official numbers often describe production in impressive terms. But daily experience wasn't measured in tons or output. It was measured in cues, in the weight of a single loaf of bread, in whether a child's favorite treat ever appeared. It was measured in the convenience or absence of something as ordinary as cooking oil. This gap between what was said and what was lived shaped how people understood reality. It wasn't dramatic rebellion. It was a quiet, steady awareness that survival depended less on what was promised and more on what could be obtained. And in that gap, entire ways of living took shape. In the next part, we'll move deeper into the kitchen table, into the substitution meals, the improvised recipes, and the small, persistent decisions that defined what people actually ate when food wasn't available. When we talk about substitution meals, it can sound abstract, like an economic concept. But in reality, it took place on cutting boards and stovetops, in the clatter of enamel pots, and the smell of onions browning in oil that had been reused again and again. Substitution wasn't only about replacing one ingredient with another, it was about reshaping the idea of what a proper meal was supposed to be. A dish that once included meat might become a dish flavored by the memory of meat, a few scraps boiled for broth, then removed to be saved for another day. Something called cutlets might contain more bread and grain than actual meat, but the name remained the same, carrying a sense of continuity even as the contents changed. People stretched ingredients with a kind of quiet ingenuity: breadcrumbs mixed into ground meat, grains added to soup until it became nourishment and not just liquid, thin slices arranged carefully across plates to give the impression of fullness. And yet, these choices were rarely talked about as acts of resilience. They were simply practical responses to a system that rarely aligned with daily need. In many kitchens, there was a special drawer or shelf where, for holidays, items were stored: a tin of fish, a box of chocolates, a jar of jam. These weren't just foods. They were symbols of possibility, held back for moments that felt worth marking. Using them too soon meant risking emptiness later. So much depended on timing. Some weeks, there might suddenly be one product everywhere, for instance, carrots in absurd abundance, or canned peas piled high in crates. Households would buy more than they needed, not because they especially wanted them, but because it was there now and might not be again. Then came the quiet challenge: how to turn repetition into variety. Carrots grated into salads, stewed into soups, caramelized with onions, preserved in jars. The same ingredient transformed in multiple ways so that meals didn't feel identical even when they were built from the same foundation. This constant improvisation shaped taste in subtle ways. Foods that were plentiful, even if not especially loved, became familiar comforts simply because they were dependable. Meanwhile, foods that appeared rarely, citrus fruits, good sausage, certain sweets, took on a dreamlike quality. They were remembered, anticipated, imagined, long before they were eaten. And when they finally appeared, there was no guarantee that everyone in the household would be able to get them. Children sometimes received priority. If there were only a few oranges, they went to the youngest members of the family. Adults quietly took less, rarely speaking about it out loud, but understanding the logic almost instinctively. This is where the emotional reality becomes clearer. Feeding a family under shortages wasn't only about calories. It was about managing worry, balancing fairness, and preserving dignity around the table. Meals were not just food, they were reassurance, proof that even under constraint, normal life could continue. But normal life depended on more than what could be found in the store. Behind many urban households, especially in smaller cities and towns, there existed another layer of food security: gardens, dachas, and rural relatives. During summers, people traveled to small plots of land, sometimes officially assigned, sometimes informally inherited, where they grew potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, berries, and herbs. These places weren't romantic country retreats in the modern sense. They were working spaces built around the necessity of producing for the winter ahead. Days were spent planting, weeding, harvesting. Evenings were spent washing vegetables, cutting them, packing them into jars. Vinegar boiled on stoves, lids clicked shut, shelves filled slowly with preserves that would become essential months later. What couldn't be eaten now was transformed into something that could survive the cold season. Cucumbers became pickles. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Fruit became compote. The language of seasons translated directly into the architecture of storage. Jars stacked in basements, cellars, balconies, and hallways. These were not luxuries. They were insurance. And still, every jar represented hours of labor, not just physical, but logistical. Supplies for canning had to be obtained. Jars had to be reused, lids traded or borrowed. Families sometimes helped each other in quiet, informal networks, lending tools, sharing seeds, exchanging surplus from one crop for another. In households without access to land, the situation could feel different. Some people relied entirely on urban availability, which made shortages more acute. Others developed relationships with friends or relatives who lived outside the city. Traveling back with a bag of potatoes or a sack of onions wasn't just a visit, it was a transfer of security. Long-distance train rides often carried passengers with bundles and crates, carefully tied with rope, wrapped in cloth. These weren't souvenirs, they were provisions. And yet, relying on these systems required something that can't be measured in statistics: trust. Trust that a relative would share a harvest. Trust that a coworker might quietly put aside something from a delivery. Trust that a neighbor would watch your place in line when you had to step away. It was in these spaces between scarcity and support that daily life actually took shape. But there was another layer still, one that many people understood instinctively: the informal networks that existed alongside the official economy. Certain jobs, especially those linked to storage, transportation, or food distribution, carried a kind of unseen influence. Someone who worked at a warehouse or bakery might be able to obtain small quantities before they ever reached shelves. Not in large amounts, and not always, but often enough to matter. These weren't dramatic black markets in the cinematic sense. They were quieter, more complicated, often based on exchange rather than money. A favor returned for a favor. A piece of meat in exchange for repair work. A few kilos of flour in return for help with paperwork. A bottle of good vodka saved for the right moment to ask for assistance. None of this guaranteed abundance. It simply softened the edges of shortage for those who had access and left others more vulnerable. Which brings us back to the kitchen table, where these larger systems became personal. Sitting down to a meal meant confronting a subtle mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that there was something to eat. Unease that it depended on conditions beyond one's control. That tension shaped how people thought about the future. They learned to save, to stock, to plan months ahead. They learned to see food not as a single moment of consumption, but as a chain of decisions stretching forward into time. Still, one question lingered beneath all of this. How did people emotionally reconcile the difference between what they were told about abundance, progress, stability, and what they lived day after day in the stores and kitchens of their own neighborhoods? Queues were more than lines of people waiting for goods. They were social spaces, emotional spaces, places where time slowed down and uncertainty gathered. Standing in line for hours became a part of daily rhythm. People brought small stools, newspapers, knitting, or simply patience. Conversations unfolded not in bursts of excitement, but in measured, practical tones. Where did you hear there would be delivery? Was it butter or just margarine? Did someone say which factory it came from? Information traveled along the line like a quiet current. A rumor at the front would ripple toward the back. Sometimes someone would leave deciding it wasn't worth the risk, and others would reshuffle, weighing the odds all over again. But there was another feeling too, the sense that every hour in line was an hour borrowed from something else. From work, from rest, from family time. It wasn't framed as sacrifice. It was framed as necessity, an ordinary calculation of priorities under extraordinary conditions. And inside that calculation lived a subtle emotional load. Some people used humor to soften it. Others stayed silent, conserving energy. For many, queuing was accompanied by an unspoken worry. What if the goods run out just before my turn? The line would move forward. The counter grew closer. People counted silently. How many loaves left? How many packages remaining? When something ran out mid-queue, the sound wasn't dramatic. It was a small, collective exhale, a shared recognition of effort without result. Those who did manage to buy something often walked home with a mix of relief and self-consciousness. Carrying heavy bags through the streets meant answering quiet questions from strangers. Where did you get that? Knowing that passing along the information might lengthen another queue somewhere else. At home, the arrival of food turned into a small event. Packages were placed on the table. Items were unwrapped slowly, not for ceremony, but because every purchase carried decisions. What to use now, what to freeze, what to save for a day when nothing might be available. Sometimes, opening a bag meant discovering a different quality than expected: meat that was tougher, fruit that had bruises, bread that would go stale quickly. Adjustments followed automatically. Tough meat became broth. Bruised fruit became compote. Bread was sliced and dried so none would be wasted. Daily life absorbed these imperfections without dramatic complaint. But the emotional landscape was not flat. There was pride in managing well, in keeping a household supplied, in making meals stretch, in being resourceful. There was also fatigue. Not the loud exhaustion of a crisis, but the steady, quiet tiredness of constantly planning, constantly adjusting, constantly thinking 2 meals ahead. Some evenings, the kitchen became a reflective space. Not a place of despair, but of honesty. The sound of a kettle boiling, the dim light over a small table, a conversation spoken softly after children had gone to bed. People asked questions that didn't appear in newspapers or speeches. How long will it be like this? Will next year be better? Are others managing the same way? The answers were rarely certain. Yet life continued around these uncertainties. Birthdays were celebrated. New Year's tables were prepared with care, even if the ingredients required months of advance effort to gather. A cake might consist of substitutions and improvisations, but it still held meaning not for its richness, but for the effort behind it. Moments of joy existed alongside constraint. A delivery of fresh fruit in winter, a rare type of sausage, a cake bought from a bakery after hours of waiting. These moments felt larger than the objects themselves. They became memories not because they were luxurious, but because they stood out against monotony. And this created an emotional contrast that can be difficult to understand from the outside. Scarcity didn't erase everyday life. It shaped it. Children went to school. adults went to work. Meals were eaten at kitchen tables that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. But behind that ordinariness was a constant mental calculation, a steady background awareness of supply, timing, and risk. The question was never just, what will we eat tonight? It was, what will we eat next week? What if the store has nothing tomorrow? What can be saved and what must be used now? This way of thinking became habitual and, for many, invisible. It was simply how life worked. But beneath that habit lay a deeper dissonance. The difference between lived experience and official narrative. Speeches spoke of progress. Reports spoke of production, targets fulfilled. Charts described harvests and industrial output. Yet people measured reality in kilograms and minutes. In how much butter could be bought this month. In how many hours it took to find cooking oil. In whether the grocery shelves in their neighborhood ever actually matched the slogans on the wall. This gap didn't always produce loud criticism. More often, it produced a quiet, reflective distance, a sense that real life existed in a space parallel to the one described on paper. And it is within that space that the true story of Soviet daily food life exists. Not as a single narrative of deprivation, and not as a nostalgic tale of simplicity, but as a complex, layered experience in which resilience, fatigue, creativity, and constraint intertwined. For many people who lived through those years, memories of food are not just about taste, they are about time, responsibility, and the quiet weight of care. Feeding a household under uncertainty changed how relationships worked inside the family. The role of the person who managed food, often a mother, grandmother, or older relative, carried both authority and pressure. They weren't only cooking. They were coordinating, strategizing, preserving, and planning months into the future. Their knowledge was practical, almost tactical. They knew which store occasionally had better flour, which clerk might give a warning before a delivery, which neighbor could be trusted to share information honestly. They kept mental maps of markets, queues, transport routes, and prices, even though prices themselves were often fixed. What changed wasn't the cost, but the presence or absence of goods. This knowledge was rarely spoken of as expertise, yet it was exactly that. It determined whether a household stayed stocked through winter or faced sudden gaps. It influenced when to open a jar and when to save it, when to cook generously and when to stretch. And for many, it created a subtle emotional anchor. Managing food became a way of protecting the people they loved, not dramatically, but steadily, meal by meal, year by year. That responsibility could be exhausting, but it also carried meaning. It was a form of care that existed even when choices were limited. At the same time, shortages affected dignity in small, often invisible ways. People took pride in being good hosts, inviting someone to visit, offering tea, placing something on the table. These were gestures of respect and warmth. Under scarcity, those gestures required effort. A single box of chocolates could be saved for months, brought out only for important occasions. Hospitality didn't disappear. It became quieter, more intentional. A guest might be offered the best piece of food, even if the household itself had little. Not out of show, but out of a deeply rooted value. The table still had to express generosity, even when generosity meant sharing something small. Those who grew up in this environment often remember contrasts rather than absolutes. They remember meals that were simple, but eaten together. They remember rare treats that felt luminous in memory, not because they were extravagant, but because they were rare. They remember long winters broken by the taste of homemade preserves, flavors tied to summers spent working in gardens and fields. And yet, alongside these memories exists something quieter, the sense of constant effort in the background. The mental checklist that never disappeared. The awareness that food security was not stable, not guaranteed, always slightly fragile. This fragility shaped identity. People learned not to waste, learned to save wrapping paper, jars, containers, bits of string, learned to repair rather than replace, learned to be cautious with optimism, learned to expect fluctuation rather than consistency. These habits outlasted the shortages themselves. Years later, long after conditions changed, some people continued to stock pantries, to keep spare supplies, just in case. To feel uneasy when a cupboard seemed too empty, even if logically, they knew food was available. Memory, in this sense, remained practical. And that brings us back to the original question. What did people eat when the stores were empty? They ate what they could find, what they could grow, what they could trade for, what they could preserve. They ate meals shaped by availability rather than preference, by patience rather than abundance. But the deeper story lies not only in the ingredients, but in the meaning attached to them. Food became a measure of care, of competence, of responsibility, a symbol of normal life maintained under unstable conditions, a quiet form of resilience, not heroic, not romantic, simply persistent. And yet, there's one final layer to this story. Because when we look back now, through statistics, photos, or documentaries, it can be tempting to describe the era in broad terms: shortage, scarcity, planned economy, collapse. But lived experience was not a headline. It was a morning queue in winter, a jar stored for 6 months before being opened, a meal stretched just enough so everyone could eat, a kitchen filled with both worry and warmth. It was a world where the difference between what existed on paper and what existed on the table shaped every day quietly, steadily, and deeply. These memories endure because they were not abstract experiences. They were lived through small, ordinary actions, repeated thousands of times. They are remembered through the weight of a shopping bag in the cold, through the smell of boiled potatoes on a weekday evening, through the feel of a metal spoon scraping the bottom of a pot to make sure nothing was wasted. For many, those years shaped a particular way of seeing the world. Food was never just food. It was time, effort, patience, and in a quiet way, vulnerability. A loaf of bread represented hours spent in line. A jar of preserves represented days of labor in the summer heat. A single piece of fruit brought home unexpectedly represented luck, or kindness, or timing. Looking back, people often speak about the contrast between external calm and internal calculation. From the outside, life could appear orderly. Streets were quiet, routines stable, workplaces structured. But beneath the surface, daily existence required constant adaptation, a flexibility that was rarely acknowledged openly. This tension between appearance and reality is part of what makes the story of Soviet food shortages so revealing. It shows how systems can appear stable on paper while feeling uncertain in practice. It shows how ordinary people carry the weight of that gap, not through dramatic confrontation, but through continuous effort, through patience, through persistence. The kitchen, in this sense, becomes a historical archive. Not a physical archive of documents or statistics, but an archive of gestures, stirring, boiling, preserving, sharing. The ways meals were prepared and distributed within households reflect a deeper truth about how people experienced their society. They lived not inside speeches or reports, but inside their own routines. And those routines were marked by a steady awareness that food, something so basic, could not be taken for granted. There is also a paradox in these memories. Many who lived through shortages recall hardship and fatigue, but they also recall connection, family members working together in gardens, neighbors sharing information, coworkers helping one another quietly. Scarcity made life harder, but it also revealed networks of mutual reliance that do not always exist in times of abundance. That does not romanticize the experience. It simply recognizes that human relationships adapt alongside material conditions. And that is perhaps the clearest insight we can draw from the question that opened this story. What did people eat when the stores were empty? They ate meals shaped by constraint, but sustained by effort, by planning, by networks, and by care. They navigated a world where official abundance often coexisted with personal scarcity, and where survival depended as much on relationships and improvisation as on production statistics. Understanding this doesn't require exaggeration or tragedy. It requires attention to the ordinary, to the long queues and quiet kitchens, to the shelves that sometimes held nothing, to the meals that were simple but necessary, to the emotional weight carried by those who made sure others were fed. In the end, this story is not only about shortages. It is about what it means to feed a family when certainty is absent, and how, in that space between promise and reality, daily life continues, quietly and persistently, one meal at a time.